Good evening and welcome. Today I shall be reading The Devil's Guard, a novel by George Robert Elford. But before that, I just want to preface with how I originally heard about this book and my preconceptions of it. So I was listening to a podcast by one Augustus Sol Invictus, who is a lawyer and political activist from the southern United States. Now, he also has a number of YouTube channels, one of which is his Revolutionary Conservative channel, which has a podcast titled Guerrilla Radio. On that, he had a guest speaker, and the two of them were discussing, I forget the exact episode number, but in either case, the two gentlemen were discussing the topic of right-wing youth organizations and political activism and youth organization. And the topic came up of recommended reading for people hoping to get involved in such endeavors. Now, they mentioned the Handbook for Right-Wing Youth, which I have yet to read but hope to, and as I recall, they basically came to the conclusion that it was a little advanced for the average teenager or early 20-something in the present era. One book, however, that he did cite as being required reading in his required reading in his household for all of his kids once they'd come to the appropriate age, was this one here, Devil's Guard. And all I know of it thus far is basically it chronicles the story of various former, I want to say either Wehrmacht or SS soldiers who, following the end of the Second World War, decided to continue their crusade against communism by siding with, it was either the French or the Americans, I can't remember quite what they said offhand. In any case, they decided to ally themselves with one of those two factions or both, and decided to continue their crusade against communism in the jungles of Vietnam. Now, that premise alone had me hooked right there, and honestly, I was just stunned that I'd never heard of this, and moreover, I was all the more stunned that nobody had ever made a movie adaptation or anything of that kind. Now, it's entirely possible, given the age of the text, that there may well be an audiobook already in existence, in which case this is simply me rehashing that, more or less, and retreading old ground. However, if that isn't the case, then I feel all the more compelled to read this thing in its entirety for my listeners here. Now, in any case, with that out of the way, and without further ado, let us begin. Devil's Guard by George Robert Elford. That's the cover page there from this ebook edition. Next page. Bomb for bomb. Bullet for bullets. Murder for murder. Page 3. Credits page, I see. Adel book. Published by Dell Publishing Corporation, Incorporated. 1 Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, New York, New York, postal code 10017. To my dear Canadian friend, Roy Cook. That there's the dedication by the author to his dear friend, Roy Cook. Who is, fellow Canadian, wonderful. Now with the copyright and credits section. Copyright C. 1971 by George Robert Elford. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic or mechanical, including photocopying, recording, or by any information storage and retrieval system, without the written permission of the publisher, except where permitted by law. For information, address Delacorte Press, New York, New York. And then they have the publishing house's address and mailing information here, if I'm not mistaken. Dell TM, which would be trademark, 6811510, Dell Publishing Co., Incorporated. ISBN number 0-440-12014-4, reprinted by arrangement with Delacorte Press, printed in the United States of America. One previous Dell edition. New Dell edition, first Dell printing, May 1985. Printed in the United States of America. And now here we have the introduction and summary stuff by the original publisher or author, presumably. In 1954, the French were trying to fight the Viet Minh with armored convoys and isolated garrisons, but the, quote, war against guerrillas, end quote, says the man who calls himself Hans Josef Wegmüller, is not a war of airplanes and tanks. It is a war of wits. And, as fought by Wegmüller and his comrades in the French Foreign Legion's Nazi battalion, it was also a war of terror. It was a war in which bamboo landmines were countered by booby traps that combined Tuchionic precision with primal bloodlust. A war where one side fought with children and the other slaughtered them. A war where every soldier, German, French, or Vietnamese, prayed to die without torture and to be buried with his body in one piece. Publisher's note: this book is being published to provide the reading public with a clear insight into the mind and personality of an unregenerate Nazi, to show the dehumanization of men in war, and to illustrate the ironies and hypocrisies to which men are driven in defense of their actions. The publication of this book is in no way indicative that the publisher agrees with or condones the points of view it expresses. We now have another quote here. South, cruel South, dreary nights and days, green rolling green, where death rides on the trails. You are weary? Carry on, until the bitter end. You are Devil's Guard, the battalion of the damned. A Legion marching song. Next page here, page 5. We have the introduction and the summary of the chapter titles. Introduction first, followed by the foreword. Then, Chapter 1, Unconditional Surrender. Chapter 2, The Tarnished Fatherland. Chapter 3, The Battalion of the Damned. Chapter 4, The Convoy Must Get Through. Chapter 5, Operation Triangle. Chapter 6, Humane and Inhumane Interludes. Chapter 7, The Man Hao Incident. Chapter 8, Raid into China. Chapter 9, The End of a Garrison. Chapter 10, With Bayonets and Arsenic. Chapter 11, Ambushed. Chapter 12, Dialogue with an Agitator. Chapter 13, Those Innocent Non-Combatants. Chapter 14, Action and Vengeance. Chapter 15, Move Quietly, Kill Quickly. Chapter 16, The Little Traitors. Chapter 17, The Red Highway, Operation Deluge. Chapter 18, The Last Battle, Operation Firefly. Followed by the closing remarks by Tim Hildebrand, and here at last they say again, text printed in the United States of America. On to page 6 now. Introduction. Working in the Far East as a zoologist, I met many interesting people, and occasionally a few truly extraordinary individuals. One of them was the real author of this manuscript, one Hans Josef Wegmüller, the one-time SS partisan Jaeger guerrilla hunter who later became an officer of the French Foreign Legion in French Indo-China, now known as Vietnam. We met in a bar in the capital city of a small Asian nation of which he is now a citizen. He was interested in my anesthetic rifle equipment. I think they mean to say aesthetic, not anesthetic. In either case, aesthetic rifle equipment which I was using to immobilize wild animals for scientific research. I stand corrected. He's talking about a dart gun. So yes, anesthetic is correct. I used to be a hunter myself, he said to me with a smile I will never forget. I was a Kopfjäger, a head hunter, as you would say in English. You hunt elephants, rhinos, and tigers. I hunt the most agile of all beasts, man. You see, my adversaries were by no means any less ferocious than their counterparts in the animal world. My game could think, reason, and shoot back. The majority of them were what we now call the Viet Cong. They posed as gallant freedom fighters, the redeemers of poor people. We used to call them the mechanized hordes of a space-age Genghis Khan. If there was a spark of truth in the Hitlerian credo about the existence of superior and inferior races, we met the real subhumans in Indo-China. They tortured and killed for the sheer pleasure of causing pain and seeing blood. They fought like a pack of rabid rats, and we treated them accordingly. We negotiated with none of them, and accepted no surrender by those who were guilty of the most horrible crimes that man or devil can conceive of. We spoke to them in the only language they understood, the machine gun. The life story of Hans Josef Wegemuller is a long and unbroken record of perpetual fighting. He fought against the partisans in Russia during World War II. He spent over 5 years in French Indo-China, fighting against what he described as the same enemy wearing a different uniform. When that was over, he moved into a small Asian country to train its token archaic army in the intricacies of modern warfare and the use of modern weapons. He is quoted as saying, "I have managed to turn a horde of primitive, superstitious, and undisciplined warriors into a crack division of daring soldiers," he stated with pride. You could incorporate them in any European army without further drilling. The head of state, where he now lives, has granted him citizenship. The local university has bestowed upon him the title Honorary Professor of Military Sciences. He is now Hindu by religion and has a local name. At the age of 64, he is still going strong. His day begins with rigorous physical exercises. Target shooting is still his favorite pastime, and his steely blue eyes are still deadly accurate when looking through the gun sight. When the United States of America became entangled in the Vietnam conflict, Hans Josef Wegemuller offered his experience to the American High Command in a long letter that remained unanswered. He quotes from it below. "I probably made a mistake by having written a somewhat haughty and in a way maybe a bit lecturing letter," he said. But our own long and unbroken record of victories against the very same enemy in the same land was still fresh in my memory then. And the unnecessary death of every American soldier, every debacle that could have been avoided, hurt me deeply. I could not think of the Vietnam War in any way except that it was my own war. Those GIs scouted the same jungle trails where we had trekked for many years. Many of them had to die where we survived. Somehow, it was an inner compulsion to regard them as comrades in arms. And you know what? I'm not surprised that young Americans are tearing up their draft cards and refusing to go to Vietnam. To take young college boys out of their super-civilized surroundings and cast them into the primitive jungles of Asia is nothing but murder. Sheer, unadulterated murder. Only experts, highly skilled and experienced anti-guerrilla fighters can survive in the jungles of Asia. It takes at least a year of constant fighting before a recruit turns into an expert. After that evening together, which left me shaken and sleepless for the rest of the night, I asked Wegemuller if he would tell me his entire story. He obliged by talking into the microphone of a tape recorder for 18 consecutive days. I have merely altered some of his technical military phraseology for the sake of better understanding. This is a true document with nothing essentially changed except the names. Wegemuller obliged me to keep his true identity, as well as that of all the others, undisclosed. I am requesting this not because of my being a war criminal. I have told you the true story. I can give you my word of honor on it. I still consider myself a German officer, and a German officer will keep his word of honor no matter what. But I have an 87-year-old mother whom I would never expose to endless inquiries by the authorities and by the press. And there are certain people mentioned in my story who are still living in my hometown near the Swiss frontier and who helped many other fugitive German officers to avoid prison and prosecution after the war. I do not know who the other fugitives may have been, but what I do know is that there were close to 2,000 comrades in distress who left Germany the very same way I did in 1945. The escape route was extremely well organized, and it is quite possible that some important Nazis used it too. Another important consideration is that I should not embarrass certain high officials of my adopted country who have been helping me ever since my arrival here. Besides, he added with a smile, I was not very popular with the Chinese People's Army, and China is not very far from here. He wants his share of the author's royalty to go to the widows and orphans of those Americans who fell in Vietnam. I have all I need for the rest of my life, he said. I want no money, only justice to German officers and soldiers who were correct to the core, yet had to share the disgrace of a few. And I want to show the enemy stripped of its mask of gallantry and heroic myth. I have refrained from adding any comment of my own. It is up to the reader to form his own judgment, as it is up to history to pass the final mandate upon him, his companions, and their deeds. Note from George Robert Elford, published and written 1971. Rather, I should say this letter itself is dated 1971. And now here on page 8, we have the foreword to the text, allegedly quoted verbatim from the officer who bore witness to the events involved. Foreword. I have seen many deadly landscapes, from the Pripet swamps in Russia to the jungles of Vietnam. Unfortunately, most of what I saw was seen only through a gun sight, with no time to enjoy the scenery. I was a Kopfjäger, a headhunter, as our comrades of the Wehrmacht used to call us. We were a special task force of the Waffen-SS, the Fighting SS, which had nothing to do with the concentration camps, deportations, or the extermination of European Jewry. Personally, I never believed that the Jews could or ever would become a menace to Germany, and I hated no people, not even the enemy. I never believed in German domination of the world, but I did believe that Germany needed Lebensraum very dearly. It was also my conviction that communism should be destroyed while still in its cradle. If my beliefs should be called Nazism, then I was indeed a Nazi, and I still am. During the Second World War, my task was to frustrate guerrilla attacks and suppress insurgency in our vital rear areas and around communication centers, seldom farther than 50 miles from the front lines. Regardless of age or sex, captured guerrillas were, as a rule, executed. I was never interested in their race or religion and tolerated no outrage against prisoners. My orders were to hang them, but I permitted the brave ones to die a soldier's death, facing the firing squad. During 5 long years, we executed over 1,000 guerrillas. If there were Jews among them, we shot them too, but without any religious prejudice. I have not stayed away from Germany because of my crimes, but because I have no desire to behold what they call Germany today. a land of bowling Yawol Johans who can only repeat yes sir or da tovarish in either American or Russian servitude. The present German army is only a shadowy midget of its former self. The old Wehrmacht needed neither foreign advisors nor protectors. It is a fact that we have lost 2 offensive wars, fighting alone against the entire world. But I doubt that the Wehrmacht would have lost a defensive war had the frontiers of the fatherland been invaded from the outside. Once our German engineers built the best fighting aircraft in the world, and I believe that we can still build the best if given a chance. Instead, we must use starfighters in which the young German airmen are obliged to fly kamikaze missions. About 80 of them have already crashed without having been shot at. Germany is obliged to purchase foreign rubbish, tanks for instance, many of which are probably inferior to our wartime Tigers and Panthers. Our formidable NATO allies will not permit German industry to produce equipment for the army. Our best brains are siphoned away by foreign countries because our government will not pay them the wages they deserve. Should another war come, Germany will be expected to stand by her allies, who are, nevertheless, still scared of the Tushians, and any proposal for a German rearmament remains anathema for them. Our Western allies have yet to realize that the map of the world has changed. Now the nations of all continents may choose between only 2 camps. Any thought of neutrality between those 2 camps is nothing but self-delusion that will crumble under the first serious pressure from the outside. Fortunately, the East German regime fares no better. The Russians, too, would think twice before giving the People's Army any sophisticated weapon. But the Volksarmee has an ideology to follow, and it certainly does not have draft dodgers. I spent 5 years in Indo-China, fighting the same enemy that I had fought in Russia, wearing another uniform. I know well the marauders of Ho Chi Minh. We fought them and routed them 100 times, in the mountains, in the jungles, in the swamps. We beat them at their own game. We never regarded the terrorists as demigods or specters who could not be destroyed. After our years in Russia, we could put up with hardship and misery. When we arrived in Indo-China, we were not beginners. When we moved into communist-dominated areas, there was soon peace. Sometimes it was the peace of the bayonet, sometimes the peace of a cemetery. But it was peace nonetheless. Not even a lizard would dare to move against us. If history records any French victory in Indochina, it was won either by the French paratroops, who were magnificent fighters, or by us Germans. The war in Indochina was not lost on the battlefield, but in Paris. The Americans are losing the same war in Paris, right now. Paris and Geneva, the only battlefields where the Western world has suffered debacles, and where the Western world will always lose. It is, of course, nonsense to say that the American army cannot defeat the guerrillas in Vietnam by force of arms. After all, the American fighting men defeated Japan. The jungles and swamps of Guadalcanal or Okinawa offered no easier going than, for instance, the Mekong Delta. Besides, what army in military history was more effective in jungle fighting than the Imperial Japanese Army? But now, American generals are compelled to fight world opinion instead of the Viet Cong. History will only repeat itself. At the beginning of the Second World War, the German generals were free to plan and conduct their own battles, and they won every battle on every front. Then Hitler took command and everything was lost. When General MacArthur was permitted to act to the best of his abilities, the world saw a marvelous landing at Incheon and the North Korean rout. But when he had to obey orders coming from 10,000 miles away, American soldiers had to sacrifice their lives for no gains whatsoever. C'est la guerre. A note from Hans Josef Wegemuller. As for that last sentence there, c'est la guerre, or la guerre, I don't speak French, therefore I cannot speak to what that actually means. I can look at a translation at a later date. In any case, this on page 9 concludes the foreword, and now here on chapter 1, we have chapter 1, Unconditional Surrender. The Devil's Guard by George Robert Elford. Chapter 1, Unconditional Surrender. The news of the German capitulation reached us by radio deep in the Czechoslovakian mountains, east of Liberec. We had been up to there for almost a month, holding an important pass, waiting for the Russians to come. But as the days went by, nothing disturbed our positions, and even the local partisans refrained from engaging us in a major skirmish. Unusual stillness blanketed the peaks and the valleys, the sort of sullen tranquility that, instead of relaxing the mind, only charges it with tension. Strange as it may be, after 5 long years of war and hundreds of engagements with the enemy, both regulars and insurgents, we were in no condition to bear the quiet of peace. Of all the natural human functions which we had once possessed, we seem to have retained only those that were important for our immediate survival: to eat, to sleep, to watch the woods, and to pull the trigger. None of us doubted that the end was near. Berlin had fallen, and Hitler was dead. Military communications had long since broken down, but we could still listen to the foreign broadcasts, including those of the victorious Allies. And we knew that our saga would not end with the capitulation of the Wehrmacht, that there would be no going home for the tired warriors of the vanquished army. We would not be demobilized, but outlawed. The Allies had not fought only to win a military victory. Their main objective was revenge. The last dispatch which we had received from Prague 8 days before had ordered us to hold our positions until further orders that never came. Small groups of haggard German soldiers came instead, unshaven and hollow-eyed troops who had once belonged to every imaginable service in the Wehrmacht, the SS, the Luftwaffe, and the SD, in brackets here, security service. Among them were the surviving members of a decimated motorized infantry brigade, a Luftwaffe service group, a panzer squadron left with only 2 serviceable tanks. There were also 5 trucks of a one-time supply battalion and a platoon of field gendarmes. The remnants of an Alpenjäger battalion had survived the retreat all the way from the Caucasus to the only to end up with us near Liberec. We were all waiting for a last sensible order, the order to evacuate Czechoslovakia and return into Germany. The order to cease hostilities came instead. For us, deep in hostile territory, the news of the armistice sounded like a sentence of death. We had no one to surrender to except the Czech guerrillas or the militia, neither of which recognized military conventions of honor. Up to the very end, we expected to be ordered back to Germany before the weapons were laid down. We could expect no quarter from the partisans. We had killed too many of them for that. As a matter of fact, we could expect no prisoner of war treatment from the Red Army either. The truck drivers of the supply battalion might be pardoned, but not the Waffen-SS, the arch-enemy. In a sense, we felt betrayed. Had we known in advance that we were to be abandoned to our fate, we would have withdrawn despite our orders to stay. We had taken more than a soldier's share of the war, and no one could have accused us of cowardice. For 5 long years we had given up everything: our homes, our families, our work, our future. We thought of nothing but the fatherland. Now the fatherland was nothing but a cemetery. It was time to think of our own future and whether our beloved ones had survived the Holocaust wrought by the superfortresses during the last 2 years of the war. They're talking there about area bombardment and carpet bombing of cities and civilian targets. The superfortress bombers were, I can't remember if those were British or American design, but God, they leveled the hell out of Germany. Anyway, continuing. Our headquarters had ordered us to, quote, stay where we are and hold the pass, end quote. Then our headquarters returned to Germany, like the Roman sentry who had stood his guard while Vesuvius buried Pompeii. We too remained soldiers to the bitter end. We had survived the greatest war in human history. But if we were to survive peace, the most bloodthirsty peace in history, we had to reach the American lines 200 miles away. Not because we thought much of American chivalry, but at least Americans were Anglo-Saxons, civilized and Christian men in their own way. Around us in the valley were only the Mongolian hordes, the tatters of a mechanized Genghis Khan Stalin. I had the notion that it was only a choice between being clubbed to death by cavemen or submitting to a more civilized way of execution. To reach Bavaria and the American lines, we had to cross the Soviet-controlled Elbe River. We were still confident of our own strength. We had survived more hell than could possibly wait for us on the way home. German soldiers do not succumb easily. We could be defeated, but never crushed. All day long, Captain Ruel of the artillery had been trying to reach the headquarters of Field Marshal Schöner. No one acknowledged his signals, but finally he did manage to contact General Headquarters at Flensburg. I was standing close to him and saw his face turn ashen when he lowered his earphones. He was shaking in every limb and could barely form his words as he spoke. It's the end. The Wehrmacht is surrendering on all fronts. Keitel has already signed the armistice, by God. Unconditional surrender. He wiped his face and accepted the cigarette which I lighted for him. The fatherland is finished, he muttered, staring into the distant valley with vacant eyes, gazing into the abyss. What now? Suddenly, it dawned on us why the Russians had refrained from forcing the pass. The Soviet commander had known that the war was about to end, and he did not feel like sacrificing his troops only minutes before 12 o'clock. But he was aware of our presence in the neighborhood. Within 6 hours after the official announcement of the German capitulation, Soviet P-2s appeared overhead. Circling our positions, the planes dropped a multitude of leaflets announcing the armistice. We were requested to lay down our weapons and descend into the valley under a flag of truce. German officers and soldiers, the leaflet read. If you obey the instructions of the Red Army commander, you shall be well treated. You will receive food and medical care due to prisoners of war, according to the Articles of the Geneva Convention. Destruction of war materiel and equipment is strictly prohibited. The local German commander shall be responsible for the orderly surrender of his troops. Had our plight not been so bitterly serious, we could have sneered at the Russians quoting the Geneva Convention, something the Kremlin had neither signed nor acknowledged. The Red Army could indeed promise us anything under the Articles of the Convention, for it was not bound by its clauses. The following morning, our sentries spotted a Soviet scout car as it labored uphill on the winding road to our positions. From its mud guard fluttered a large white flag of truce. I ordered my troops to hold their fire and called a platoon for lineup. Everyone was shaved and properly dressed. I wanted to receive the Soviet officers with due respect. I was astonished to see the car stop 300 yards short of our first roadblock, and instead of sending forward parliamentaries, the enemy began to deliver a message through loudspeakers. Ah, I see, like parlay, as in they say parliamentaries. I've never seen that word before, but gist of it is they mean to parlay, to meet and chat and negotiate the terms of their surrender. In either case, I was astonished to see the car stop 300 yards short of our first roadblock, and instead of sending forward parliamentaries, the enemy began to deliver a message through loudspeakers. Officers and soldiers of the German Wehrmacht, the Soviet High Command knows that there are Nazi fanatics and war criminals among you who might try to prevent your accepting the terms of armistice and consequently your return home. Disarm the SS and SD criminals and hand them over to the Soviet authority. Officers and soldiers of the Wehrmacht, disarm the SS and SD criminals. You will be generously rewarded and allowed to return home to your families. The filthy fucking liars, Untersturmführer Eisner sneered, watching the Russian group through his binoculars. They will be allowed to return home. Puh! That's a good joke. It was amusing to note how little the enemy knew the German soldier. After having fought us for so many years, the Soviet High Command should have known better. Cowardice or treason was never the trade of the German soldier, nor was naivete. They had called us fascist criminals or Nazi dogs ever since Operation Barbarossa. In the past, they had made no distinction between the various services. Wehrmacht, SS, or Luftwaffe had always been the same to Stalin. Yet now he was endeavoring to turn the Wehrmacht against the SS and vice versa. The loudspeakers blared again. Eisner pulled himself to attention. Herr Obersturmführer, I request permission to open warning fire. No, nothing of the sort, gentlemen. Colonel Steinmetz, the commanding officer of the small motorized infantry group, protested. We shouldn't fire at parliamentaries. Parliamentaries, Herr Oberst? Eisner exclaimed with a bitter smile. They are sheltering behind the flag of truce to deliver communist propaganda. Even so, the colonel insisted, we may request them to withdraw, but we should not open fire. Being an officer of the Wehrmacht, Colonel Steinmetz had no authority over the SS. He was, however, a meticulously pedantic officer and much our senior in both in rank and age. I did not feel like entering into futile arguments, especially in front of the ranks. Trying to avoid the slightest offensive quality in my voice, I reminded him that I was in charge of the pass and all the troops gathered therein. Even so, the colonel stiffened at my remark and said, I am aware of your command, Herr Obersturmführer, and I hope you will handle the situation with the responsibility and tact of a commander. The Russian loudspeaker kept blaring. Eisner struggled and began to observe the enemy again. I exchanged glances with Erich Schultz and saw defiance in his eyes. Both men had been my comrades for many years. Bernhard Eisner had been my right hand since 1942. He was a cool and hard fighter. Having been well-to-do landowners, Eisner's father and elder brother had been beaten to death by a communist mob during the short-lived, quote-unquote, proletarian revolution after the First World War. It was Bernard's conviction that no communist on earth should be left alive. Schultz, who had joined my battalion in 1943, was rather hot-headed, but always polite and considerate. A few steps from where we stood, two young troopers sat behind a heavy machine gun, which they kept trained on the Soviet scout car. Their faces were tense, but lacking emotion, as though they were statues or a part of the gun itself. Both were young men, only 19 years old. Drafted in 1944, they had not experienced the real trials of war that the rest of us had been subject to. I asked for a loudspeaker and addressed the Russians. This is the German commander speaking. We have not received an official confirmation of the armistice, and we will hold our positions until such confirmation can be obtained. I request the Soviet commander to furnish an authentic document related to the question of armistice. I also request that, in the meantime, the Soviet propaganda unit refrain from using the flag of truce for communicating subversive propaganda. I request that the Soviet propaganda unit withdraw from our position within 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, I shall no longer consider them immune to hostilities. German officers and soldiers, disarm the SS and SD criminals and hand them over to Soviet authority. You shall be generously rewarded and allowed to return home. I request once again that the Soviet propaganda unit refrain from using the flag of truce for communicating subversive propaganda. I repeated. There was a pause. Then the loudspeakers blared once more. German officers and soldiers, disarm the SS and SD criminals. Before they could continue, I ordered, fire! The scout car burst into flames, and then exploded. When the smoke and dust settled, we saw 2 Red Army men scurrying down the road. That should fix them for the time being, Eisner remarked, lighting a cigarette. Bullets are the only language they understand. An hour later, a squadron of Stormoviks dived out of the clouds with the intention of strafing and bombing our positions. To reach us, however, the planes had to come in level between a cluster of high cliffs, then drop sharply over the small plateau which we occupied. The Russian pilots flew well, but they had bad luck. I had deployed 8 88s, by which he means 88mm guns, and 10 heavy machine guns to cover the narrow corridor, and our gunners were experienced men. Within a few minutes, 5 of the planes had been shot down. Trailing smoke, 2 more had escaped towards the valley, and a third one had banked straight into a 300-foot rock and exploded. Fuel, bombs, ammunition, and all. At that point, the 4 remaining planes had given up and departed without having fired a shot. We spotted 2 Soviet pilots parachuting downward. One of them hit a cliff, slipped his chute, and tumbled to his death at the bottom of a ravine. The other one, a young lieutenant, landed right on one of our trucks. He was made a prisoner. Here they have Russian words. Zvravast vyut, tovarish. Captain Ruel, who spoke impeccable Russian, greeted our astonished visitor. My men searched the pilot. I looked into his identification book, but handed it back to him. And when Schultz gave me the officer's Tokarev automatic, I only removed the bullets and returned his gun as well. He was so surprised at my unexpected behavior that his chin dropped. He tried to smile, but he could not. He only managed to draw his lips into a paralytic grin. "The war is over," he muttered. "No more shooting," he added after a moment, imitating the sound of a submachine gun. "No ta-ta-ta-ta." His face showed so much terror that we could not help smiling. He must have been told that Germans were man-eaters. "No more ta-ta-ta, eh?" Erich Schultz chuckled, mocking the Russian. The pilot nodded quickly. "Da, no more war." Schultz poked him in the belly. "No more war, but a minute before you wanted to bomb the living daylights out of us here." "Ya," the Russian repeated, his eyes glued to Schultz's SS lapel. Erich poked him gently again, and the Russian paled. When they say poke, I think they mean punched him in the bloody chest. Anyway, "Leave him alone," Captain Ruel interposed. "You are scaring the shit out of him." "Sure," Eisner added. "And we don't have many extra pants up here, Erich." The captain spoke to the pilot briefly, and his presence seemed to lessen the Russian's fear. "Don't let the SS shoot me, officer, please," he pleaded. I have been flying for only 8 months, and I want to go home to Mother." We have been fighting for 5 years, good sir. Imagine how much we would like to return home. Captain Ruel replied with a bitter smile. Don't let the SS shoot me. The SS won't shoot you. Schultz offered the Russian a cigarette. Here, smoke. It will do you good. Thanks, comrade. The pilot grinned, taking the cigarette with shaking fingers. Erich opened his canteen, gulped some rum, then wiped the canteen on his sleeve and offered it to the pilot. Here, tovarish, drink good SS vodka. Realizing that his life was not in danger, the Russian relaxed slightly. Our commander says that you don't want to surrender, he said, shifting his eyes from face to face as though seeking our approval for what he was saying. You must surrender, you know. There are 2 divisions in the valley. 40 tanks and heavy artillery are expected to come in a day or 2. Tovarish, you have already told us enough for a court-martial, Schultz exclaimed, slapping the pilot on the back. You shouldn't tell the enemy what you have or don't have, you know, Captain Ruel interpreted for him. I only said that heavy artillery is on the way. Who cares? Eisner shrugged. There is a mountain between your artillery and us. The mountain will not help you. The Russian shook his head. He turned and pointed towards a ridge 5 miles to the southeast. The artillery is going up there. Nonsense, I said. There's no road. There is a road, Captain Ruel interposed. Right up to Hill 506. We had 4 Beauforts there in early March. Looking at the map, I realized that Captain Ruel was right, and what the Russian pilot was saying had a ring of truth. Should the Soviet commander mount some heavy artillery on that hill, he could indeed shell our plateau by direct fire. We gave the Russian a hearty meal and allowed him to leave. He was immensely happy and promised to do everything for us should we meet again after surrendering. Food, vodka, cigarettes, comrade. My name is Fyodor Andreevich. I will tell our commander that you are good soldiers and should be well treated. Sure you will, Eisner growled, watching the Russian leave. You just tell your commander, and you will be shot before the sun is down as a bloody fascist yourself. The pilot walked away slowly, turning back every now and then as though still expecting a bullet in the back. Having passed our last roadblock, it must have occurred to him that he was still alive and unhurt, and he began to race downhill as I had never seen a man run. Eisner was not very enthusiastic about the Russian's departure. He saw everything we have up here, he remarked with barely concealed disapproval in his voice. We had no choice but to let him go. Colonel Steinmetz challenged him sharply. The war is over, Herr Untersturmführer. Not for me, Herr Oberst, Eisner replied quietly. For me, the war will be over when I greet my wife and 2 sons for the first time since August 1943, and it isn't over for the Russians either. He came here flying not the white flag, but a fighter-bomber, after all. I haven't seen my family since June of 1943, the colonel remarked. I drew Eisner aside. You shouldn't worry about the Ivan, I told him with an air of confidence. What can he tell? That we have men, weapons, tanks, and artillery? The more he tells, the less eager they will be to come up here. I put an arm around his shoulder. Bernard, we've killed so many Russians, we can surely afford to let one individual go. He grinned. I have read somewhere what the American settlers used to say about the Indians, Hans. The only good Indian is a dead red Indian. I think that is also true of the Bolsheviks. Maybe the pilot was not a Bolshevik. Maybe he wasn't. Yet. But if you ask me, Hans, I can tell you that anyone who's working for Stalin is game for me. He lit a cigarette, offering me one, then went on. I know that we are defeated and that there will be no fatherland to speak of for a very long time to come. For all we know, the Allies might break up the Reich into 50 little principalities, just as it was 500 years ago. We scare them stiff, even without weapons, even in defeat. But I cannot suffer the thought of having been defeated by a rotten, primitive, lice-ridden communist mob. I know that no conqueror in history was ever soft on the conquered enemy. We might survive the American and the British, but never the Soviet. Stalin won't be satisfied with what he may loot now. He will not only take his booty, but he will try to take our very souls, our thoughts, our national identity. I know them. I've been their prisoner. It was for only 5 days, but even then, they tried to turn me into a bloody traitor. The Russians are mind snatchers, Hans. They will not only rape our women, they will also turn them into communists afterwards. Stalin knows how to do it, and now he will have all the time on Earth. He is going to increase the pressure inch by inch. I could gun down anyone who's helping Stalin. You would have quite a few people to gun down, Bernard. Starting with the British and finishing with the Americans. They have not only helped Stalin, but also brought him back from his deathbed and made him a giant. Stalin will be most obliged to his bourgeoisie allies, Eisner sneered. Just wait and see how Stalin will pay for the American convoys. Give him a couple of years. Mr. Churchill and Mr. Truman are going to enjoy a few sleepless nights for Mr. Roosevelt's folly. That won't help us much now, Bernard. I guess not, he agreed. After a brief pause, he added, If you decide to surrender, Hans, just let me have a gun and a couple of grenades. I'll find my way home. You won't be alone. I gave him a reassuring tap. I don't feel like hanging in the main square of Liberec either. I don't feel like submitting myself to what comes between the surrender and the hanging, he added with a sarcastic chuckle. Early in the afternoon, the P-2s returned, but we did not fire on the flimsy canvas planes which carried no weapons. The Russians had sent us another load of leaflets, among them newspaper cuttings announcing the armistice and photocopies of the protocol bearing the signature of General Field Marshal Keitel. Again, we were requested to lay down our weapons and evacuate into the valley under the flag of truce. This is it, Colonel Steinmetz spoke quietly, as he crumpled the Soviet leaflets between his fingers. This is it, by God! And as though providing an example, he unbuckled the belt which supported his holster, swung it once, and tossed the belt on a flat slab of stone. I expected nothing else from Colonel Steinmetz. He was a meticulously correct officer, a cavalier of the old school who would always keep to the letter of the service code. He could see no other solution but to comply with that last order of the German High Command, or what little was left of it. Moving like automatons, his 300 officers and men began to file past our sullen group, the troops casting their rifles and sidearms onto the mounting pile. But the artillery, the small panzer detachment, and the Alpenjägers kept their weapons, and, with a skill born of habit, the SS took over the vacated positions. I am truly sorry, Colonel Steinmetz said quietly, and I noticed that his eyes were filled. I cannot do anything else, you understand. There is no longer a high command, Herr Oberst, and the Führer is dead. You are no longer bound by your oath of allegiance, I reminded him. He smiled tiredly. If we wanted to disobey orders, we should have done it a long time ago, he said at last, right after Stalingrad, and not on the front, but in Berlin. You mean a successful 20th of July, Herr Oberst, eh? No, he shook his head. I think what Stauffenberg did was the gravest act of cowardice. If he was so sure of doing the right thing, he should have stood up, pulled his gun, shot Hitler, and taken the consequences. But I don't believe in murdering superior officers. The Führer should have been declared unfit to lead the nation and removed. Had Rommel or Guderian taken command of the Reich, we might have won. If not the war, at least an honorable peace. It is neither too late or still too early to discuss the Führer's leadership. Don't you think, Colonel Steinmetz? You are right. Now all we can do is hoist the white flag. We have no white flags, Herr Oberst, Captain Ruel remarked with sarcasm. White flags were never standard equipment in the Wehrmacht. The colonel nodded understandingly. "I know it is painful, Herr Hauptmann, but if we refuse to surrender, the Russians may treat us like we treated their guerrillas." "Are you expecting anything else from the Soviet, Herr Oberst?" Eisner asked. "The war is over, good sir. There is no reason for more brutalities," said the colonel. He turned towards me. "And you? What do you intend to do?" I suggested that we should try to reach Bavaria, 200 miles away, but the colonel only smiled at my idea. "By now, the Russian divisions are probably streaming towards the lines of demarcation," he said. "All the roads and bridges will be occupied by the Russians, and precisely opposite the American lines you will find most of their troops. Stalin does not trust either Churchill or Truman. He has exterminated his own general staff. Do you think he would trust Eisner or Montgomery? The days of our heroic Western allies are over for Stalin. In a few weeks' time, the Western allies will be called bourgeoisie, decadent imperialists, and Stalin will deploy 1 million troops on the western frontiers of his conquest. Besides," he added after a brief pause, "you should not expect much from the Americans, Herr Obersturmführer. I have heard many of their broadcasts." "So too have we," Eisner remarked. "Then you should know about their intentions. A prisoner is always a prisoner. The conqueror is always right, and the vanquished is always wrong." "We have no intention of surrendering, Herr Oberst, neither here nor in Bavaria," I said softly. "Are you planning to go on fighting?" "If necessary, and until we arrive at some safe place." "Where, for instance? Spain? South America? The devil knows." "You should not count on Franco. Franco is all alone now, and they might well put pressure on him soon. With Hitler and Mussolini dead, Stalin will never tolerate the existence of Franco. The last strong leader in Western Europe, Stalin knows that he will be able to push around everyone but Franco. He will regard Spain as a potential birthplace, or rather, a place of resurrection for the Nazi phoenix. And to reach South America, you will need good papers and plenty of money. But, to speak of more immediate problems, do you have enough food to reach Bavaria? I know you have enough weapons, but your trip might take 2 months over the mountains, and I presume that is the way you intend to go. Men cannot live on bullets. We have enough food for 2 weeks. One can always find something to eat. It is getting onto summer now," I said. "There are villages and farms even in these mountains." He shook his head disapprovingly. "Are you planning to raid the farms and villages? Will you shoot people if they refuse to accommodate your needs?" "If it is a matter of survival, Colonel Steinmetz," Eisner said before I could answer. He left the sentence unfinished for a moment, and then added, "Have you ever seen a humane war?" It will no longer be an act of war, but merely common banditry," the colonel stated frankly. "Of course, you still have the power to do it, but you won't be able to do it in silence. The Czechs will know about you. The Russians will know about you and your destination. The news of your coming might reach Bavaria before you do. And we might have an American reception committee waiting for us at the frontier. This is what you wanted to say, Herr Oberst," I interposed. "Precisely," said he. "And if, up till now, you haven't committed something the Allies may call a war crime, you had better not furnish them with any evidence now." "Herr Oberst," I spoke to him softly but firmly, "if we do reach Bavaria, nothing will stop us from getting further, neither the Americans nor the devil himself. We have given up many things a man would never willingly part with, and we are ready to give up yet more, even our very lives, but not our right to return home. On that single item we shall never compromise." "I wish I was as young as you are," Colonel Steinmetz spoke resignedly. "But I am tired and weary, Herr Obersturmführer, so very tired." Despite the old soldier's pessimism, I felt that somehow we had a fair chance of getting through, saving at least our bare lives, if nothing else. The prospect of being hanged by the guerrillas, or at best carted off to a Siberian death camp, did not appeal to me at all. The colonel might survive. He might even return home one day. The SS, though, could entertain no illusions about the future. No Soviet commander would lift a finger to protect us. Should their Czech allies decide to get even with us, the Russians would quickly forget about their so-called Geneva Convention pledge for humane treatment. For 7 years, the Czechs had been waiting for this day, and I could not blame them either. In 1944 alone, we had killed over 3,000 of their guerrillas. We should travel high up in the mountains, avoiding contact with the enemy. We have excellent maps of the areas involved, and if necessary, we can fight our way through a Soviet brigade. With a few hundred men? The colonel asked skeptically. We have at least 100 light machine guns, Colonel Steinmetz, Eisner interposed. We can put out so much fire that the Ivans will think a division is coming. But for how long? Hell! We can play hide-and-seek in the woods until the day of judgment, Herr Oberst. Schultz exulted. We should at least try, damn it. To surrender here is sheer suicide. What have we got to lose? One may commit suicide at any time, after all. Bernhard Eisner and Captain Ruel were of the same opinion as I. We have mountains and woods all the way to Bavaria, Ruel said. I am quite sure that every one of us has been through similar trips a dozen times in the past. The colonel shook his head slowly. Hiding in the forest? Sneaking in the night like a pack of wolves? Stealing or robbing food at gunpoint? Shooting people if they resist? No, gentlemen. I have been a soldier all of my life, and I shall finish it all like a soldier, obeying the orders of those who are entitled to give them. The Soviet commander down in the valley, for instance, Eisner remarked bitterly. The colonel frowned. I am talking of General Field Marshal Keitel and Grad Admiral Dönitz, he said. Keitel and Dönitz have no idea what a dreck we are in, Herr Oberst. I guess not, he agreed. They have 80 million other Germans to worry about now. We are only a few hundred. We are not so important, gentlemen. We are neither heroes nor martyrs. We are only a part of the statistics. The death of a single individual may be very sad. When 100 die, they call it a tragedy. But when 10 million perish, it is only statistics. I still believe in discipline, even in defeat. And we are defeated. The only trouble is that I still cannot feel that I am licked, Schultz remarked with a grin, tapping the stock of his machine gun. Not while I still have this thing in my hands. But I would like to see the Ivan who comes to tell me all about it. Oh, shut up, Erich! I snapped curtly, and he froze with a brisk jawohl. This isn't the right time for wisecracking. I turned to the colonel. Herr Oberst, I am convinced that you will have a better chance if you surrender to the Americans. I have already advised you not to expect too much from the Americans, Herr Obersturmführer. All that is going to happen from now on was agreed upon by the victors a long time ago. But I must concede, he added with a smile, that an American jail might be somewhat more civilized than those of Stalin's. Stalin would kill 1 million Germans cheerfully. The Americans will meticulously prove that they are doing the just and legal thing. On doomsday morning, they will give you a nice breakfast, a shave, a bath, and, should it be your last wish, they might give you a perfumed pink rope to hang on. But the end will be the same. I spoke to the rest of the troopers, telling the men frankly that Colonel Steinmetz's decision was the only correct one, as far as the military code goes. But the German army had ceased to exist, and therefore I no longer considered them my subordinates, but only my comrades in peril, who had the right to speak for themselves. As for myself, I stated I would leave for Bavaria. The artillery platoons, the panzer crew, the Alpenjägers, they decided to follow the SS rather than surrender. You might be a bunch of sons of bitches, Captain Ruel said, smiling, but you seldom fail. I am with you. The motorized infantry and the supply group were from Colonel Steinmetz. The colonel shook hands with us, and I saw anguish in his face as he spoke in a choked voice. I can understand you. It is going to be hard on the SS. The victors have already decided that you are nothing but killers, including your truck drivers and mess cooks. I wish you all a safe arrival, but be prudent and do not make it harder on yourself than it already is, Herr Obersturmführer. With a gently ironic smile, he handed me his golden cigarette case, his watch, and a letter. Take care of these for me, he asked quietly. Give them to my wife if she is still alive and if you can ever find her. I will do it, Herr Oberst. I swear it. His officers and the men followed the colonel's example and began to distribute their valuables among those who were to stay. The Ivans would take everything away, some of them remarked with a shrug. In exchange, we gave them our spare shirts and underwear, some food, cigarettes, and most of our medical supplies. Then Colonel Steinmetz assembled his troops. We saluted each other, and they departed. We could hear them for a long time as they marched down the winding road singing the colonel, 6 officers, and NCOs under an improvised flag of truce. Oh, hang on a minute. We could hear them for a long time as they marched down the winding road singing. The colonel, 6 officers, and NCOs under an improvised flag of truce, and a bedsheet. Behind them, 270 men, beaten but not broken. The men were singing. Pardon me there. Initially, I thought they were going to say the name of the song they were singing, and that bedsheet appears to be what they had fashioned the flag of surrender and or truce from. Continuing on now. 2 miles down the road, around a lonely farmhouse at watch, were the Russians and a battalion of militia with 6 tanks and a dozen howitzers. In the valley near the village, we could observe more Red Army troops. The beloved old tunes began to fade in the distant valley where the road turned into the wood as it followed the course of a small creek. The singing was abruptly drowned in a sharp staccato of a dozen machine guns. Explosions in rapid succession shook the cliffs, echoing and re-echoing between the peaks, and we saw fire and smoke rising beyond the bend. It lasted for less than 5 minutes. The howitzers and machine guns fell silent. We heard the sporadic reports of rifles. Then everything was still. Standing on a boulder overlooking the valley, Captain Ruel lowered his field glasses and slowly raised his hands for a salute. Tears were flowing freely from his eyes, down his cheeks and onto his iron cross. I saw Schultz bowing his head, covering his face in his hands. Only Eisner stood erect, staring into the valley, his face like that of a bronze statue. My own vision blurred, my stomach knotted. I turned towards my men, wanting to say something, but my words would not form. I felt an attack of nausea, but Eisner spoke for me. There is the Soviet truce for you, men. I know easier ways to commit harikiri. Harikiri is Japanese ritual formal suicide of the military persuasion as practiced by the traditional warrior class of that country, the samurai. Anyway, continuing now. 3 PO2s rose from the fields and came droning over the hills. We dispersed, taking cover, and resolved not to reveal ourselves no matter what the enemy might do. Flying a slow merry-go-round, the flimsy planes began to circle the pass and came in low over the trees. Working the dials of our wireless, Captain Ruel quickly tuned in on the Russian wavelength. He translated for us the amazing He translated for us the amusing conversation between the squadron leader and a command post somewhere in the valley. Igor, here's Znaima. Ponemais? There are no more Germans up here, the pilot reported. You got them all. Znaima, none of the ones here belong to the SS. We examined all the bodies. Fyodor Andreevich says the SS commander and his 2 officers are not among the dead. Znaima, take another look. Fyodor Andreevich, the Russian pilot whom we had permitted to leave. Cigarettes, food, and vodka. Eisner must have read my thoughts, for he remarked quietly, "What did I tell you, Hans?" "The positions are empty," the pilot reported. "I can see the gun emplacements and 2 tanks. Znaima, if there were more troops here, they must have withdrawn into the woods. Igor, try to locate them. Ponemais?" 15 minutes later, the PO2s left, and soon afterward, we spotted Soviet infantry moving up the road. 2 companies with 3 tanks to lead the way. Their progress was slow, for a dozen yards ahead of the tanks, a group of demolition men moved on foot, searching for mines. We allowed them to proceed up to the 5th bend below the pass, where the road narrowed to traverse a small bridgehead between the rising cliffs. The demolition squad spent over an hour looking for mines or hidden electric wires around the place, but neither the bridge nor the road around it had been mined. Our engineers had a better idea. They had enlarged a natural cave on the precipitous slope and stuffed nearly 2 tons of high explosives into the crevasse. Observing the enemy through his binoculars, Bernard Eisner slowly raised his hand. A few yards from where he stood, a young trooper sat, his hand gripping the plunger of the electric detonator, his eyes transfixed on Eisner's hand. From down below came coarse Russian yells. The leading tank lurched forward. The enemy was moving across the bridge. Eisner's hand came down. "Los!" There was an instant of total silence, as though the charge had misfired. Then, earth began to rumble. The rocks seemed to rise. Stone and wood exploded from a billowing mass of flames and gray smoke. The tanks stopped. The infantry scattered, taking shelter, or what they thought was shelter. High above the road, a cluster of cliffs tilted, hung at a crazy angle for an instant, then began to tumble down. A cascade of earth, stone, and shredded pine roared from above to carry tanks, cars, and troops into the abyss below. 1 car and some 50 Red Army men escaped the landslide and now clung to a short stretch of road that had turned into a flat, coverless platform, a jutting precipice with no way to escape except by parachutes. We waited until the smoke and the dust settled, then opened up on the survivors with 2 88mm guns, direct fire with fragmentation shells, at 300 yards. Only 8 shells were fired. There were no survivors. "I guess this is the end of World War II, Erich Schultz remarked when our guns fell silent. "Sure," said Eisner, pointing towards the debris down below. "Down there are the first casualties of World War III. Hee. We stripped off our rank badges, army insignias, and emblems, tore up our identity papers and paybooks, burned everything, including our letters from home. The Panther tanks and the guns went over the precipice. They were faithful companions, and they had served us well. None of them should fall into enemy hands." Ammunition for the rifles, machine guns, and submachine guns had been distributed equally among the men. We had more than enough bullets and grenades. Each man could carry 5 spare mags and 100 loose bullets along with 6 grenades. Our supply of cheese, bacon, margarine, and other food stores had been likewise distributed. Water was no problem. There were plenty of creeks and brooks and streams in these mountains. We were about 3 miles away when the Stormoviks came buzzing over the plateau. This time they could fly the corridor unpunished. The planes bombed and gunned our vacant positions for an hour without a break. When some of them departed, others came, and their uncontested attack was delivered with true communist zeal and determination. The action would surely be remembered by Soviet war historians as a great Russian victory. 7 weeks of hard trekking followed. We kept in the mountains, moving mainly at night, resting in remote ravines or in caves when we came upon some large enough to accommodate us. Only in the caves could we light small fires to boil coffee or to warm up our canned meat and vegetables. There was no need to warn the men about eating sparingly. Our self-imposed ration was 1 meal per day. Every day we spotted swarms of PO2s as they flew reconnaissance over the woods, sometimes passing overhead at treetop level. Fortunately, we could always hear them coming from miles away and had time to scatter and camouflage. We strapped green twigs around ourselves and onto our helmets. I'm going to reread that paragraph from the top, pardon me. Every day we spotted swarms of PO2s as they flew reconnaissance over the woods, sometimes passing overhead at treetop level. Fortunately, we could always hear them coming from miles away and had time to scatter and camouflage. We strapped green twigs around ourselves and onto our helmets, and we looked more like moving bushes than men. When a trooper froze, no one could spot him from 20 yards. After about a week, the planes stopped worrying us. The Russians had given up the futile idea of detecting us from the air. Instead, they endeavored to block every bridge and every pass in our way, compelling us to choose the most impossible trails for our grueling journey. When we could cover 5 miles in one night, we considered it good going. It was a trying cat-and-mouse game. Death was away only in time, but never in measurable distance. The enemy had never really known where we were, and with the element of surprise preserved, we were strong enough to challenge a battalion of Russians. We could have pierced their roadblocks, but the action would have given away our presence in a specific area, and also our direction. By avoiding contact, we kept the Russian commander in suspense. He could only guess which part of the map we were headed for. We wanted to preserve the element of surprise for the most perilous part of our trip, namely, the crossing of the Elbe River. Therefore, I decided to bypass the enemy roadblocks and stick to the paths of the mountain goats. Erich Schultz, who was born and had grown up in the Alps, and some Austrian alpine rangers were of immense help to us. In a small clearing, not very far from our trail, we came upon a dilapidated hunting lodge. Eisner spotted 2 Red Army trucks parked under the trees, a most unwelcome sight. A pair of CMCs could transport 80 men, and there was no way of bypassing the place except by making a 20-mile detour. I decided to wait and see whether it was only a coincidence or a trap in the making. Then, suddenly, we heard the thud of axes and trees falling. The enemy was only cutting wood. We wanted to lie low until the Russians departed, but fate decided otherwise. Escorted by a dozen Red Army men, a small group of German prisoners emerged from the woods. Pushing and pulling at the heavy logs, the men tried to lift their burden onto the trucks. As the prisoners strained, the Russians amused themselves with filthy oaths of laughter. Some of them were kicking the men as they struggled, past their grinning guards. Schultz suddenly swore, Gottverdammte Nachtmahl! Look over there! He exclaimed and handed me his binoculars. They are officers! I could distinguish 2 officers among the working prisoners. They were the ones the Russians seemed to abuse the most. I don't know why there's so many spelling errors in this text, perhaps because it's a translation, and a free one at that. In either case, I could distinguish 2 officers among the working prisoners. They were the ones the Russians seemed to abuse the most. "The taller one is a captain," Eisner announced. "The other one I can't tell." "What shall we do about the poor devils?" Schutz queried. "We can't sit here and look on." I glanced at my men, deployed along the forest's edge. Filthy, unshaven, and worn as they were, I could see on their faces that they would have resented inactivity. "I am all for freeing them," I said briskly, answering their silent question. "But if we still want to reach Bavaria, we should stage a pretty good diversion afterwards." For some days we had been moving northwest, making a beeline for a small German town by the name of Sebnitz, where we hoped our people could help us in our trip across the Elbe. We could not liberate the prisoners without killing the Russians and consequently revealing our presence to the enemy, the very thing I was trying to avoid all the way. A line drawn on the map between the pass which we had evacuated and the small clearing down below would inevitably point at the border near Sebnitz. I turned the problem over and over in my mind, but it seemed more hopeless at every new angle. Captain Ruel found the only feasible solution. "We wanted to move towards Sebnitz," he began excitedly, motioning us to have a look at the map. "Having hit the Russians here, we will probably have all night before the enemy sends someone up to investigate. We are about here." He placed his finger on the map, then looked up. "After liberating the prisoners, we should turn south, away from Sebnitz and the German frontier. Here is a small village. We could make it by midnight. We need some civilian clothes anyway. I don't think our folks at home will have many clothes left. A quick raid on the village might confuse the Russians, especially if we grab every Czech identity paper we come across." "Czech papers, of course!" "Czech papers!" Schultz exclaimed. "Whatever for?" Ruel grinned. "The Russians might conclude that we are heading inland towards Austria. Otherwise, why would we collect Czech identity papers?" "I think it's a good idea, Herr Hauptmann," a young lieutenant of the Austrian Alpenjäger remarked cheerfully. "Austria is precisely the place we would like to go. After the raid, we might as well keep going south." "And run into a Soviet blocking party?" Eisner grunted. "You had better stick with us, taking the longer way, but arriving safely. After the raid on the village, we should double back towards the north and cross the border at Sebnitz," Captain Ruel concluded. "So be it," Eisner stated, and I agreed. Captain Ruel's plan seemed as feasible as any we might conceive. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, both trucks were loaded and the prisoners had been lined up for head count. There were 23 of them in all, escorted by 12 Russians. Schultz deployed 3 sharpshooters for each Russian army man. "Drop them with a single bullet, otherwise some of the prisoners may get hurt." "Oh, don't worry," one of the troopers remarked. "At 200 yards we could hit a field mouse between the eyes." Schultz waited until the prisoners had climbed aboard the trucks. Standing in a small group, the Russians watched them with their submachine guns at the ready. "Fire!" said Schultz. 36 rifles fired a single volley in unison. The bewildered prisoners threw themselves flat, thinking they were about to be killed. But our sharpshooters had aimed well. There was no return fire. Our liberated comrades, as we soon learned, had been captured 5 days before the capitulation. The majority of them were officers. The captain, whose rank Eisner had recognized, was the former commanding officer of a signal battalion. He had naively believed that the Soviet commander would react chivalrously to his protest against compelling captive officers to remove roadblocks, fill anti-tank ditches, and perform other manual labor. The Soviet officer in charge, whose name Captain Valer never learned, had been quite drunk at the time, and having booted the fascist dogs from his presence, he had ordered his troops to strip the Guernesaki officers of their rank badges and insignias. Then, roaring with drunken laughter, he yelled, "Now you are no longer officers, but ordinary ranks. Tvoi mati." Captain Valer and Lieutenant Meyer were, however, permitted to retain their badges to quote-unquote serve as an example of what happens to complaining fascist officers. "Now you go and cut wood. We need telephone poles," the Soviet officer swore. "You destroyed all the telephone poles. Now you are going to make new ones from here to Moscow." "You are lucky, Herr Hauptmann, that we came by here," I said after our mutual introduction. "You were more lucky still that you could come by here at all," he replied with a smile. "There's no prisoner-of-war treatment for the SS, Herr Obersturmführer. I saw with my own eyes how the Ruskies lined up and machine-gunned 400 of your men in the Vistula." "They did that, eh?" Eisner grunted. "Not the officers, mind you," the captain added. "The officers are to be tried and hanged. It was all agreed upon between the Americans and Stalin." He uttered a short, sardonic snort. "And that will be about the only Soviet-American agreement Stalin will keep. You had better watch out, I tell you." "They won't get us, Herr Hauptmann, at least not alive," I stated, more resolved than ever to reach Bavaria. "Not me, that's for damn sure." Schultz nodded, lifting his gun. "First they'll have to take my toy away." "Oh, I expected nothing else," Eisner fumed. "Now comes the great carnage, the revenge, gentlemen. There is going to be such a bloodbath in the fatherland that all the SS ever did will look like a solemn church ceremony in comparison." "You may thank Himmler for that," Valer said. "To kill the Jews was a great folly, my friends. He could have gotten away with anything but the Jews. The Jews are a world power unto themselves, but not those wretched bastards whom Himmler was busy exterminating around the clock. These had done nothing and would never have done anything against the Reich. Nevertheless, their ghosts are returning now, many of them wearing the conqueror's uniform or the judge's stola." "But what have we got to do with the whole bloody affair?" Schultz cried. "I was hunting partisans in the Gottverdammt Russian swamps and in the forests of Belgorod." I think they mean Belgrade. "They should hang the Einsatzkommandos or the Gestapo. It was their lousy job to kill Jews, not mine. Are we responsible for what those loafers did? Don't ask me, ask fucking Stalin. What does Stalin care about the Jew? He always regarded them as a rotten bunch of capitalists. Most of the Ukrainian Jews were rounded up and executed by the Ukrainian militia, weren't they?" Just what the hell are you arguing about now?" Eisner snapped. "Himmler did kill the Jews, didn't he? Now the world needs a scapegoat, and it is the SS. Whether we pulled the trigger or just threw a ring about a village while the militia or the Gestapo rounded them up, it is one and the same thing for them. It was all because of the SS. We murdered everyone on sight, looted the corpses, and are now returning home loaded with stolen Jewish gold. We are the scourge of God, the devils incarnate, the Tushions. They are murdering right now 1 million German prisoners in Siberia. Maybe not by shooting. Stalin simply starves them to death. But what is there in terms of difference? Is there any? All right, sure, we gun down 100 hostages. They take a group of our army officers from a prison camp, give them a mock trial, then hang them. It is one and the same treatment as far as I am concerned. I know that the SS destroyed Ledis. I have not been there, but if they did it, they had a reason. Why did the SS level that particular place? Why not the other 10,000? Maybe it was because of the assassination of Heydrich. Maybe it wasn't. But there must have been a reason for it. They say the killers of Heydrich were Czech commandos from England, who dropped by chutes. Why not Why did they go hide in Ladis? They should have stood up, fought, and gone down fighting, the brave paratroopers. No one would have associated them with the Czechs in Ladis. And what if the SS destroyed Ladis? Was it an overkill? How about Hamburg, which the Allied bombers demolished, killing 80,000 civilians in a couple of hours? How about Dresden and the 100,000 civilian dead there? Just before the war's end, no less, because their execution was done by bombs and not by machine guns. Should we call the Allies saints? God damn it all, he swore, wiping the sweat from his forehead. All that kept us alive was the thought of surviving and returning home. If we still have homes to return to, he went on. Now everyone is telling us that we are going to hang. Is it enough to drive you mad? It is enough to drive you mad. I am truly sorry, Captain Valler said apologetically. I did not want to upset you, especially not after what you did for us. But I thought you had better know the truth instead of falling into a trap at home. Just let them come and try to trap me, Eisner fumed. I haven't killed an American yet, but I don't think they are any tougher than the Ivans, and I sure as hell killed a lot of Ivans, I can tell you that. That's enough for now, I interposed authoritatively. We have more urgent things to do than talk about post-war politics. How about moving on? A good idea, Captain Ruel agreed. But before we leave, let me booby-trap those CMCs. It may help the Ivans to get downhill the shorter way. The troops laughed. I don't know what a CMC is. I'll have to look that up. Anyway, continuing with the text here. I knew their nerves were strained to the breaking point, and each individual was a potential time bomb that might explode at any moment. My men were not killers at large, yet they already felt hunted, outlawed. They were brave soldiers, bled white, defending the fatherland. The majority of them had been called up to the SS, just like others had been called up to the other various services and put into uniforms. We were Nazis, to be sure, but who was not a Nazi in Hitler's Third Reich? No one could hold any position in the Reich without becoming a member of the National Socialist Party. And if someone held any position in the Reich, his son volunteered for the SS, the elite guard. Others volunteered because it was known to be an honor to serve in the SS. Besides, the uniforms were better, the food, the pay, and the treatment were better, leaves were more frequent. But no one had volunteered because he was told, join the SS and you may kill some Jews or guard concentration camps. I would never deny that the SS was probably the most brutal fighting force ever conceived in the history of warfare. We were tough, maybe even fanatics. We were scared of nothing and of no one. We were brought up to be brave. Our brutality was only iron discipline and an uncompromising belief in the fatherland and the righteousness of our cause. We had been taught and drilled to execute orders, and had I been given the order to shoot some Jews, gypsies, or prisoners of war, I would have executed that order just as I would have shot deer if ordered to do so. If that is a crime, they should hang every soldier in the world who wouldn't pull his gun and shoot his superior officer through the head whenever he feels like disobeying an order. But my orders were to ensure the safety of supply trains, to keep a forest around a vital bridgehead free from enemy infiltrators, or to track down partisans after an attack against a garrison. And that is exactly what I did. When I was ordered to take hostages, I took hostages, 10 of whom were to be shot for every German soldier murdered by the guerrillas. When the guerrillas stabbed a German sentry in the back or threw a grenade into a staff car, a given number of hostages were executed. Their names had been made known to the population in advance. The partisans had always known that if they committed murder, we would retaliate in like kind. The partisans would never tell a German soldier in advance that he was going to be killed. We, however, did tell the guerrillas that if they killed a German soldier, Piotr or Andrei would die. We gave them a chance, but they gave us none. Who was then the more guilty party? Who did actually kill those hostages? Were the partisans innocent? They were as innocent as the lever of a guillotine. The lever does not kill. It only releases the blade. As soon as darkness fell, we moved on to execute Captain Ruel's plan. We found a fairly wide dirt road that ran through the forest and, following a small advanced guard, made good progress. Having arrived at the village about midnight, we quickly deployed along the forest line, and I sent out a reconnaissance party with Schultz in charge. Schultz reported that there were no Soviet troops in the vicinity, only a group of Czech militiamen billeting in the ancient stone mansion of the local fire service. A captured Wehrmacht troop carrier stood in the archway, but he saw no sentries and the place looked ripe for the taking. I selected 90 men to form 3 groups with Schultz, Eisner, and myself in command. The rest of the troops were to stay behind under the command of Captain Ruel. I told him that should any trouble develop, he was not to interfere, but should move northward according to our original plan. Skirting the fields, we moved into the village with so many dogs barking that they should have wakened the dead. Don't shoot except in the utmost urgency, I told my men. If you have to kill, use your bayonets. And if you must use your bayonets, don't miss. And if you see a window lit up, occupy the house, Eisner added. Seize everyone you find awake. To my great relief, I discovered that the Battle of Stalingrad would not have disturbed the militiamen whom we found all boozed up and sleeping it off happily on a dozen bare mattresses strewn about the wooden floor. They haven't gotten a worry on earth, a young trooper beside me remarked as we quietly removed the militia's weapons. I sure wouldn't mind being one of them. Boy, to be able to sleep like that. With the militiamen disarmed, the occupation of the village was only a matter of routine. My troops did not wait for instructions, for they knew how to go about their business swiftly and with the skill of veterans. 1 detachment cut the telephone wires. 2 platoons left to cover the roads with machine guns. 4 men seized the belfry, an important precautionary measure for a 1 detachment cut off the telephone wires. 2 platoons left to cover the roads with machine guns. 4 men seized the belfry, an important precautionary measure, for a church's bell can be a very effective instrument if someone wishes to raise the county for miles around. The country for miles around. Church's belfry is basically the church's bell tower. I'm going to reread this entire paragraph from the top because I kept tripping over myself. Pardon me. With the militiamen disarmed, the occupation of the village was only a matter of routine. My troops did not wait for instructions, for they knew how to go about their business swiftly and with the skill of veterans. 1 detachment cut the telephone wires. 2 platoons left to cover the roads with machine guns. 4 men seized the belfry, an important precautionary measure, for a church's bell tower can be a very effective instrument if someone wants to raise the country for miles around. The wires of the air raid sirens in front of the church were also cut. Breaking up into groups of 5 men each, we searched every house, confiscated civilian clothes, food, and personnel papers, and caused great consternation amongst the people. Some of them spoke German and were told we were Austrians on our way home, terribly sorry for the inconvenience, but we needed their papers to survive the trip across Czechoslovakia. I knew that the nearest Soviet commander would be informed of our actions before dawn. At last, on German soil, at the Elbe, but still on the wrong side of the river, a battered old farmhouse stood on the edge of the woods with the burned shell of a Tiger tank visible amongst the ruins of a barn. Children were playing around the dead tank, and smoke rose from the chimney. We kept the place under observation for several hours, but spotted no Russians. Schultz at last decided to visit the farm at dusk. He returned with the farmer, a man by the name of Hans Schroll, a war cripple, a short, lean, embittered man in his early 50s, hobbling on a pair of crutches. "I shall try to help you," he said, his face showing great concern. "But keep to the woods, for heaven's sake. The Ruskies are visiting us every day, and one never knows when they might show up." "Life must be hard on you people," Captain Ruel remarked sympathetically. "Hard?" Schroll exclaimed with a short laugh. "Life here is nothing but assault, robbery, rape, and murder. I am the only man here for miles around. A half of a man at that," he added bitterly. "No, Herr Schroll." Schultz shook his head, placing a hand gently on the man's stump. "I think you are more than a man. The Ruskies herded away the entire male population," Schroll went on. "They wouldn't take me because of my leg. Nowadays, you may call yourself lucky for having lost a leg, and a female is safe only if she is 7 months pregnant or 7 years old. And even then, not always." He sat with us for a while, and from his embittered words we could form our first impression of our tarnished fatherland. A Wehrmacht battalion was still fighting on a ridge half a mile away when the invaders had raped Scholl's wife for the first time. "One of them held a gun to my head and forced me to watch," he said. "He threatened to shoot me if I moved. I couldn't have moved much even without a gun at my head, could I? They were the front-line mob. Finally, a major came yelling, trying to send the bastards out to fight. Do you know what happened to the major? They just grabbed him, took his pistol, and kicked him in the ass. Kicked him right through the door." "How is it now?" I asked warily. "Ja," he smiled resignedly. "The occupation troops are more polite. They are taking me and the children out of the room when they come to visit my wife." "Oh, don't say, Jawohl, Kameraden. The German homes have become Red Army whorehouses, every single one of them. But we should not condemn our wives and daughters for their impropriety. It is all our fault, after all. We should have fought better. Fought like the Japanese with their suicide pilots and human torpedoes. We did not kill enough Russians. We did not lose enough of our humanity then." Schroll told us about the pontoon bridge at Pirna. 4 T-34s and several machine gun emplacements covered its approaches. "No Germans are allowed to cross the bridge without a special pass," Schroll said. "You will never make it across there, but I can give you a boat." The boat was a leaky one and could carry only 8 men at most. We had to wait in the forest until the farmer had managed to patch it up. He left it at a prearranged place, driven ashore and camouflaged under the riverside shrubs. In it, we found 5 loaves of dark leaven bread, a sack of homemade biscuits, and 2 bottles of schnapps. There was also a note, "Glück auf," good luck. Only a thin slice of bread and a small gulp of brandy for each man, but it had been our first slice of bread for weeks, and the brandy itself felt good on the throat. So did the small note of Hans Schroll, a great man in a great desert. Only the clothes and the weapons were ferried across the river. The men had to swim, as it would have taken too long, making it very risky. 9 of them never made it. We pushed on towards the American zone. 4 times we ran into Soviet patrols or Czech militiamen. We had to kill them in order to survive. The enemy troops were getting thicker every day, but the closer we came to Bavaria, the more resolved we became to arrive there. We no longer cared to bypass the roadblocks or the enemy camps, but instead attacked them, pouring lead as if we had an inexhaustible supply of ammunition. We were only 42 men when we finally reached Bavaria at Wunderzeitl. 317 of our comrades had fallen so that we might arrive home. 3 miles from the border, we encountered our first American patrol, a jeepload of young men led by a lieutenant. Clean, neatly dressed, and obviously well fed, they were sitting around the jeep with a mounted machine gun having dinner. Dinner with a record player in the grass blaring the Stuka Lied, the lively march of the German dive bombers. We had the Americans like sitting ducks, but I saw no reason for killing them the way we had killed every Russian who blocked our way. I decided instead to pay them a visit, alone and unarmed. Leaving Eisner Schultz and an NCO, or non-commissioned officer, to watch the development, I left the shrubbery and walked up to the group. The soldiers stared at me with astonishment and reached for their guns. The lieutenant turned off the record player. He was a handsome young man of about 30, tall and blonde, just like some of us Tushians. He wore sunglasses which he removed to have a better look at me. "I see you are having quite a picnic here, Lieutenant." I spoke to him nonchalantly, gesturing towards their rifles that almost poked me in the belly. "You don't want to shoot me, do you? The war is over, after all." "Just who the hell are you?" he blurted out, glancing at his men, then back towards me. "What are you doing here? I thought God bless my mother." "Oh, pardon me. Just who the hell are you?" he blurted out, glancing at his men, then back towards me. "What are you doing here?" I thought God bless my mother, who had always insisted that I should learn English. "What could a German do in his own country?" I asked him in turn. "I am on my way home." "Who are you?" "Only a German officer, coming home from far away." "How come you speak English so well?" "We are quite civilized people, Lieutenant. As you see, some of us can even speak English." I noticed that they were completely taken aback by my sudden appearance, and for some time the officer seemed at a loss as to what to say or do. Eventually, he finally asked, "Are you carrying a weapon?" "Only a pocket knife." "Hand it over," he ordered me briskly. I knew he said that only to say something. I handed him my knife, and he motioned his men to frisk me. The result set him at ease. He offered me a cigarette, lighted one for himself, then, taking a notebook from the jeep, he began to rattle off a number of questions. "Your name, rank, and unit?" "Hans Josef Wegemuller," I obliged. "Obersturmführer, 21st Special Partisan Jäger Commando." "What's that?" A freckled, lanky soldier interposed. "Guerrilla hunter," the lieutenant explained, and I bowed slightly. "That's right." "Your last combat station?" "Liberec, Czechoslovakia." "Have you killed any Americans?" A squat little corporal cut in. I smiled. If there were any American troops serving in the Red Army, then I sure as hell did. The lieutenant made a quick, impatient gesture. He said he was in Czechoslovakia. He said to the corporal. Wehrmacht or the SS? He now demanded to know. I could barely conceal my amusement. Only the SS had Obersturmführers. The Wehrmacht had lieutenants. I shrugged. Wehrmacht, SS, Luftwaffe, what's the difference to you? Oh, there's a hell of a difference, buddy, he snapped. The Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe go home, but we hang them SS cutthroats good and high. He extended his hand. Show me your pay book. I haven't got any, I replied. How come? Well, I just figured that our paymaster's office might be closed for a good long while, so I threw my pay book away. He frowned. You like jokes, don't you? He remarked curtly, and turned to the squat little corporal who wore a pair of horn-rimmed glasses. Joe, you'd better call headquarters on this one. Oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you, Lieutenant, I suggested mildly, and lifted a protesting hand towards their guns, which were coming up once more. Please, don't threaten me. At this very moment there are at least a dozen rifles pointed at you. My men are expert marksmen, and they are a bit nervous. I don't want to see you killed unless in self-defense. The soldiers paled or palled visibly. The lieutenant ran his tongue over his lips, but his confusion did not last for long. My troops began to emerge from the woods with their guns providing the necessary dramatic undertone. Their chins dropped, then their weapons. The lieutenant began to unbuckle his holster, but I stopped him. Oh, never mind your guns, Lieutenant. We don't want to shoot at each other. The war is over, after all. We took them, jeep and guns, and record player back into the woods. Nicht schießen, Kamerad, squat little Joe muttered in broken German. Don't shoot. Somewhat bitterly, I acknowledged that even the SS cutthroats could quickly turn into comrades when the business end of the submachine gun had turned the other way. The face of the lieutenant revealed sheer agony. He must have thought we were going to kill them right then and there. I motioned the Americans to sit down on a fallen log and told them briefly about the surrender of Colonel Steinmetz and our odyssey across Czechoslovakia. They seemed rather impressed. Are you telling me that the Russians just gunned them down under a flag of truce indiscriminately? The lieutenant asked. It is a hell of a way of treating prisoners of war. Indeed, Lieutenant, I queried him sharply. Do you consider hanging more sophisticated? We aren't going to hang anyone without a fair trial, he protested. Can you call a trial of the vanquished by his victors a fair trial, Lieutenant? I presume you will be holding your fair trials in some neutral country to ensure their fairness. In Geneva, for instance. We had been listening to your broadcasts and know your intentions about the so-called war criminals. A new class of the damned. Everyone who served in the SS now belongs to them. If you speak of the Jew haters or those who preferred to guard concentration camps instead of fighting the Red Army, you might make a point. I'm going to reread that from the top. Can you call a trial of the vanquished by his victors a fair trial, Lieutenant? I presume you will be holding your fair trials in some neutral country to ensure their fairness. In Geneva, for instance. We have been listening to your broadcasts and know your intentions about the so-called war criminals. A new class of the damned. Everyone who served in the SS now belongs to that. If you speak of the Jew haters or those who preferred to guard concentration camps instead of fighting the Red Army, you might make a good case. But do you know that on Hitler's orders, every German soldier serving in the rear was free to choose frontline duty? And if a man demanded to be sent forward, his commanding officer had no right to turn him down. Do you think we frontline soldiers did not sneer at the swine who wanted to survive the war by flaying Jews alive 1,000 miles from the trenches? I was an officer of the SS, Lieutenant, and I was fighting terrorists whose mere shadows would have sent you screaming into the nearest mental institution. They were not concentration camp inmates, but armed insurgents who spat on all the game rules. Now just tell me, you immaculate American lieutenant, what will you do to guerrillas captured in your rear, wearing civilian clothes? Guerrillas who blow up bridges, derail trains, stab your buddies in the back during the night, or toss hand grenades into your officers' mess. Won't you hang them, Lieutenant? But the SS, during the Ardennes offensive. I've heard of them, Lieutenant. I cut him short. Some bastards murdered a group of American prisoners at Malmedy. If it is true, then I urge you to hunt them down. Hang them for all I care. But then go and hang some of your fellow Americans who gunned down German prisoners with their hands in the air. Just look around a bit, and you will find them, too. You shouldn't play the holy man here. You had your Chicago and Al Capone long before the SS was born. In the meantime, you had better remember that among us were thousands of enlisted men, ordinary people who had been drafted and put into SS uniforms. Or do you think they should have protested against their uniforms? How about the SS tank drivers, the signalmen, the artillerists? Would you consider them war criminals too? Would you hang them all, American lieutenant? They will be examined, each and every individual, the lieutenant stated feebly. Sure. Lieutenant, every single one of them. I'm sure they will. 500,000 individuals or more. A long pause followed. I knew that my violent outburst would be of little use, but it made me feel better to have set the record straight for at least 5 American servicemen. Again, they appeared ill at ease. What are you up to now? The lieutenant finally asked. He spoke hesitantly, as though fearing to hear my answer. I knew what he was thinking. We are up to home, I hope, I told him. You'll never make it. We have roadblocks at every bridge and every village. Every bridge itself is guarded by the MPs, and Germans need passes to travel from one place to another. The Russians had roadblocks too, Lieutenant, I answered firmly. They couldn't stop us. He stepped to the jeep and withdrew a carton of Camel cigarettes, trying to smile. Care for a smoke? You don't have to bribe us, Lieutenant. We have plenty. So I have heard. Sorry, you don't have to bribe us, Lieutenant. We have plenty, the American stated. So I have heard. You Americans seem to have plenty of nearly everything. Except common sense and political wisdom, that is. You keep your cigarettes. We have come a long way without smoking. His face clouded. My refusal sent him back to his former worries about their immediate future. What do you intend to do with us? He asked hesitantly. That depends. I hope you understand that you could be of great peril to us with your jeep and radio. Having come this far, we wouldn't like the idea of ending up in one of your jails waiting for the rope. We wouldn't give you away, he said quickly. Honestly, we wouldn't. The others nodded in consent. That, Lieutenant, we shall have to make pretty sure of. He paused again and ran a nervous hand over his face. You aren't going to shoot us, are you? Then squat little Joe said in a shaky voice, You have just disassociated yourself from the war criminals. You want to go home, you said. Hell, man, so do I. I took Schultz and Eisner aside to discuss our next move. We mutually agreed that it was about time to break up. A couple of men together might have a better chance to get some papers and make it home. If we stuck together, sooner or later it would have come to fighting the Americans too, which I wanted to avoid. Our low-keyed conversation only increased the consternation among the Americans, and they could not stand our whispering for long. Listen, officer, the lieutenant exclaimed, stepping forward. We will not hinder you in getting home. You have taken our weapons, and having been a soldier, you surely know that I cannot return to base and report to my commanding officer that we were disarmed by a group of stray Germans. I could lose my rank for that." "You may have a point there, Lieutenant," I conceded. He seemed relieved. "Why shouldn't we call it quits, eh?" he insisted. "You let us go, and we saw nothing of you." We stood for a while, facing one another. Then, on a sudden impulse, I motioned him to follow me. I walked to the edge of the woods. Pointing inward to the forest line about 2 miles away, I handed him my binoculars. "There is a wooden tower there," I said. "A shooting stand for deer hunters." "I can see it," said he. "We shall leave your weapons in that tower so that you won't lose your shoulder bars, Lieutenant. Is it a deal?" "It's a deal." I ordered my men to remove the Jeep's distributor cap and some wires of their radio set. "I am afraid that you will have to walk all the way there and back, Lieutenant. We will leave the parts with your guns, and don't walk too fast." I gave them a brief salute, and we began to move. I was a dozen paces from the Jeep when the lieutenant suddenly called out to me, "Officer!" I turned. "Keep away from the highways and don't go towards Beirut," he yelled. "The commander of counterintelligence there is a Jewish major whose entire family was killed by the SS in Poland." Oh my. In either case, that on page 32 concludes Chapter 1. Chapter 2, The Tarnished Fatherland, will be next. Now, not bad for an opening chapter of this text. Yes, in fact, very interesting opening salvo as far as telling a story with a fairly heavily propagandistic overtone. I'm enjoying it so far, but I also kind of want to... I feel this temptation to skip to the part where they're in Vietnam and forego all the introductory pleasantries about life on the home front at the end of the war. That is to say, the Second World War. Skipping over to Vietnam does seem more my cup of tea, because this is nothing new to me in light of other books of various similar forms that I have read. At the same time, though, it's interesting all the same, so I'll bear with it and perhaps even grow to enjoy it further and more so as we continue on. In either case, it is presently 1:05 p.m. or 13:05 hours on Monday, February 18th, 2019. So with that, I bid you adieu. Auf Wiedersehen. Signing off.